Unique story from Yellowstone National Park honoring the birth of a rare white bison earlier this month. The rare white American buffalo has become a sacred symbol to the men and women of the Sioux Nation, fulfilling an ancient prophecy. Oh, look how cute he is. The Lakota chief says the tribe believes a bison represents a spiritual rebirth in white.
13 bison stepped off a trailer onto Lakota land in the spring of 2023. No training, no map, no instructions. Within 48 hours, they dropped to the ground and started spinning 900 kilograms of muscle and bone, grinding into soil that had not felt wild bison in over a century. What happened next inside that South Dakota prairie stunned the researchers who had spent years running the models. Native grasses pushed back through compacted earth. Water tables shifted. Birds nested in depressions that did not exist the season before. The land did not need to be told. Neither did the bison. Stay with us. What the data uncovered will change how you see restoration forever. The land that was erased before a single fence post was driven into the ground on the Rosebud Sioux Reservation. The land had a different story.
There may be no single image that better captures the timeless spirit of the Great Plains than this. A herd of bison on the move across the prairie.
And that story stretched back 10,000 years. The Lakota people did not simply live near the bison. They built their entire world around the herd shelter, food, medicine, ceremony. Every part of the animal had a use. The hides became lodges. The bones became tools. The dung fed the fires that kept families warm through brutal winters. The stomach lining became a cooking vessel. The sinew became thread. The tail became a fly brush. Nothing was wasted because nothing could be. Out on the open plains, the bison was not just food, it was the entire supply chain of Lakota life. And in return, the Lakota managed the land in ways that kept the prairie healthy enough to support millions of animals. Controlled burns cleared old vegetation and triggered fresh grass growth along the routes the herds would follow. Selective hunting kept herd movement patterns active, rather than letting large groups stagnate in one area and overgraze it. Hunting camps were placed deliberately, shifted seasonally, and abandoned before the surrounding land showed stress. The grassland and the people who managed it were locked into a relationship so precise that ecologists today are still trying to fully map it. This was not primitive or accidental. It was sophisticated land stewardship refined across hundreds of generations, a system so effective that the prairie produced bison the way a well-managed orchard produces fruit. The soil chemistry, the plant composition, the water cycle, all of it was maintained in a state of active productivity by the combined behavior of the animals and the people moving with them. At the peak of that relationship, early European explorers estimated 60 million bison across the North American plains. That number is almost impossible to hold in your head. A single herd crossing the Platte River could take 3 full days to pass one fixed point on the bank. The ground shook. The dust was visible from miles away. Lewis and Clark, traveling through the northern plains in 1804, wrote in their journals that the herds were so dense the land appeared to move. The Great Plains grassland was, by any ecological measure, one of the most productive and biologically rich ecosystems on Earth, larger in total area than Western Europe, sustained by a relationship between species that had been running without interruption for thousands of years. Then came the railroads. Between 1870 and 1884, the most rapid destruction of any large mammal in recorded history swept across the northern plains. Buffalo hunters killed for hides and tongues, leaving the carcasses to rot across hundreds of miles of open ground.
The hide hunters prepared for another winter on the plains, believing there must still be plenty of buffalo between the Yellowstone and Missouri rivers.
The stench, by some accounts, could be detected from moving trains. Army soldiers shot from windows for sport, tallying kills the way later generations would count points in a game. The hide market in the early 1870s was paying $1 to $3 per skin. In a single good season, a skilled hunter could kill 2,000 animals. The math was simple, and the results were catastrophic. General Philip Sheridan went to Congress and said it plainly, killing the bison was the fastest way to break the Plains tribes. Without the herds, the reservations would hold. It was not a side effect of westward expansion. It was the strategy. By 1884, a federal census counted 23 free-roaming bison left on the entire North American continent. All of them were inside the boundaries of what would become Yellowstone National Park. The Lakota, confined now to reservations carved from their original territory, watched their keystone species vanish inside a single generation. People who had grown up in lodges made of buffalo hide were still alive when the last wild herd became a museum exhibit. The transition from 60 million animals to 23 had taken roughly 14 years. The prairie that remained had no bison, no Lakota land management, and no mechanism to restore what thousands of years had built. Cattle moved in. The warm-season native grasses, big bluestem and switchgrass, the species the prairie had evolved to grow, were slowly replaced by invasive cool-season varieties that the soil had never been designed to support. Without bison hooves breaking the ground, without the rotational grazing pressure that kept any single area from being locked into one state, the topsoil hardened, the water cycle shifted, the land was technically alive. Ecologically, it was a shell. That erasure took about 14 years. Undoing it would take much longer, and the effort would start not with scientists, but with the people who had managed the land for millennia before anyone drew a map. 15 years, one mission by the year 2000, something strange was happening at Yellowstone National Park. The same federal agencies that had spent a century carefully rebuilding the bison herd from 23 animals to just under 5,000 were now spending millions of dollars a year killing it. The issue was brucellosis, a bacterial disease that Yellowstone bison carry at low rates. Cattle are vulnerable to it. An infected cow can abort her calf, and the economic consequences for a ranching operation can be severe. Montana ranches, backed by the state legislature, demanded that any bison crossing the park boundary be captured and sent to slaughter. The argument was straightforward on its surface. Protect the cattle industry from a disease risk. What made it complicated was the science. In over 40 years of monitoring, not a single documented case of brucellosis transmission from wild bison to cattle in a free-range setting had ever been recorded. The disease had been transmitted from elk to cattle, never from bison. The risk that justified killing hundreds of animals every winter was, by the standards of the published literature, theoretical. Through the early 2000s, federal agents were rounding up between 501 zeros-in Yellowstone bison every single winter at the Stevens Creek capture facility.
The bison. A muscular hump supports a massive head. A snowplow that clears away drifts and uncovers buried grasses.
And shipping most of them to commercial meat packers. The facilities ran on a fixed schedule. The trucks left on a fixed schedule. And the same herd that conservation programs had spent a century pulling back from the edge of extinction was being reduced by hundreds of animals every year to satisfy a livestock policy that the underlying science did not fully support. Tribal leaders had been watching those trucks leave for years. In 1992, leaders from 19 tribal nations formed the Intertribal Buffalo Council with one goal: bring bison back onto tribal land. The founding nations understood something that the federal policy apparatus was not accounting for that. The bison and the people were part of the same system. Restoring one without the other was incomplete. By 2024, that council had grown to 76 nations across 20 states, collectively managing more than 25,000 animals. But almost every bison available to those nations carried cattle DNA from crossbreeding programs that had started as far back as the early 1900s, when well-meaning ranchers had tried to create a hardier hybrid animal. The genetic dilution ran deep through most available herds. The pure animals, the ones whose lineage had never been crossed, were the Yellowstone herd, the ones going to slaughter. For 2 decades, tribal leaders petitioned the National Park Service to transfer those bison to tribes instead of meat packers. They were turned down each time. No brucellosis quarantine protocol existed for bison. Cattle had a federal health regulatory pathway built across generations of livestock management. Bison had nothing equivalent. The bureaucratic wall was real, and it held until 2016. On the Rosebud Sioux Reservation in South Dakota, a group called the Rosebud Economic Development Corporation, REDCO, had not been waiting for permission. Since 2007, they had been building toward this moment quietly, methodically, with extraordinary patience. The strategy was not to lobby and wait. It was to prepare the land so thoroughly that when the opening finally came, they could move immediately. Partnering with the World Wildlife Fund, REDCO spent 15 years acquiring roughly 27,000 acres of native prairie on the reservation. The process was slow and deliberate. Individual parcels of land were purchased or leased one by one. Fences that had divided the grassland into cattle paddocks came down. Water infrastructure went in: stock tanks, pipelines, the kind of systems that a large free-roaming herd needs spread across tens of thousands of acres. Cattle were sold off. The land was given time to begin recovering on its own before any bison arrived. The range was renamed the Lakota Buffalo Range, a name drawn from the Lakota concept of living in peaceful balance with the natural world. It was not just a land project. It was a statement about what the land was being returned to. In 2016, the National Park Service and 2 tribal nations jointly built the first dedicated bison brucellosis quarantine facility in United States history. It was a technical solution to a political problem, a way to satisfy the disease management requirements that had been used to block transfers for 20 years.
After years of hard work, 55 Yellowstone National Park bison were transferred to the Fort Peck Indian Reservation in Poplar today.
The protocol was slow. A bison entering the program had to test negative 3 times over a minimum of 2 years before any transfer happened. Holding facilities had to be maintained. Animals had to be monitored. It was expensive and time-consuming, but it was workable. And it was the door that had been locked for 2 decades, finally open. What 48 hours changed the 13 Yellowstone bison that arrived on the Lakota range in March 2023 were different from anything the range had held before. They were not ear-tagged. They were not handled. They had no familiarity with human presence, no learned dependence on supplemental feeding, no conditioning from years of managed captivity. Born inside Yellowstone, treated as wildlife from the moment they were first caught, they carried something in their behavior that researchers could not fully measure in advance over a century of running completely wild. That distinction matters more than it might seem. A bison that has been managed, fed through winters, handled during health checks, moved through chutes and paddocks, gradually loses some of the behavioral precision that wild animals retain. The instincts do not disappear entirely, but they dull. Movement patterns shorten. Grazing becomes more passive. The animal adapts to the rhythms of management rather than the rhythms of the land. The Yellowstone bison had never experienced any of that. Every behavior they carried onto the Lakota range had been shaped entirely by open country, seasonal pressure, and a century of zero human intervention. They stepped down the ramp. They sniffed the wind. They walked. No hesitation at the fence line. No clustering near the trailer. They spread across the ground the way animals do when the land feels familiar, not because they had been there before, but because something in the grass and the soil and the wind matched something older than memory. Researchers watching from a distance noted that the herd did not bunch defensively or move erratically the way transported animals often do. They moved with purpose, even on day 1. Within 48 hours, they were wallowing. A wallow happens when a bison rolls its full body weight into the ground and spins, a behavior the animal uses to dislodge parasites and regulate its coat. What it leaves behind is a circular depression roughly 2 meters across, the surface crust broken open, the soil aerated and restructured. Dung and bacteria worked deep into the earth. No biologist designed this, no restoration program planned for it. The bison simply did what their species has always done, in soil that still knew exactly how to respond. What made the Yellowstone animals' wallowing behavior notable to the research team was not just that they did it. Managed bison wallow too. It was the frequency and the force. Wild bison, unconditioned animals running on instinct, sharpened across generations of open-range living, wallow with a consistency and physical intensity that produces deeper, more structurally complete depressions than animals accustomed to managed environments. The depressions the Yellowstone bison left in those first 48 hours were the kind that hold water through a dry stretch, that break compaction deep enough to matter, that create the microhabitat conditions native plants actually need. Here's what a wallow actually does to a grassland ecosystem, and why ecologists care so deeply about it. A wallow breaks the hard crust that decades of cattle hooves had pressed into the topsoil like concrete. Prairie soil under long-term cattle grazing develops a sealed surface layer, compacted, low in organic activity, hostile to the root systems of native warm-season grasses that need loose, aerated soil to establish. A bison wallow cracks that layer open. It creates a shallow depression that holds rainwater instead of letting it sheet off across sealed ground. That temporary pool sits at precisely the right depth and moisture level for the germination of specific native plant species that will not grow on an undisturbed compacted surface. The chemistry inside a wallow is also different from the surrounding soil. Bison dung introduces bacteria and organic material that shifts the microbial environment. The broken crust allows air and water to reach soil layers that had been sealed off. The depression itself creates variation in light exposure and temperature across a very small area.
Long before European settlers came, bison roamed America coast to coast. A major conservation effort over the last century has helped restore the animal from near extinction by hunters and illness.
And that variation is exactly what native prairie biodiversity runs on. A single wallow can over time support dozens of plant species that the surrounding land cannot produce on its own. Multiply that across a herd moving 4 to 6 miles a day, leaving depressions across thousands of acres, and the cumulative effect on soil structure becomes significant very quickly. The research team from South Dakota State University had drone surveys already scheduled. Soil sampling equipment was standing by. The question going into the first growing season was whether the data would match the models or whether something unexpected was about to happen. Something unexpected happened. Within the first growing season, aerial drone surveys showed a measurable expansion of native warm season grasses, big bluestem and switchgrass in the exact areas where the wild bison had been concentrating their movement. The invasive cool season species, primarily smooth brome, began losing ground for the first time. Smooth brome had been spreading across the Lakota range for decades, filling the ecological space left by overgrazing and compaction. It is not a plant the prairie soil evolved to support at scale. The bison did not target it deliberately, but the combination of trampling, wallowing, and rotational grazing pressure shifted the conditions that smooth brome depends on, and the native grasses started pushing back into the gaps. Soil samples taken from bison-grazed sections showed roughly a 15% increase in carbon sequestration compared to neighboring cattle pastures, consistent with findings from the American Prairie Reserve in Montana, but happening far faster than anyone had projected. Carbon sequestration in grassland soils is a slow process under normal restoration timelines. Seeing a measurable shift inside a single growing season was not what the models had predicted. Native birds started nesting in the wallow depressions. Western meadowlarks, grasshopper sparrows, and burrowing owls, all three species recorded breeding in areas that had been a uniform, featureless cattle pasture the season before. Burrowing owls in particular need bare, disturbed ground with loose soil to excavate their nest burrows. Cattle pasture does not provide it. Wallow depressions do. The birds did not need to be introduced or managed. They found the habitat on their own, within months of it being created. One growing season, no planting, no seeding, no restoration program, 13 bison doing what bison do, in ground that had spent a century waiting. The herd that refused to stay still. The second thing that surprised the research team had nothing to do with wallows. It was about movement. A commercially managed bison, or one that has been handled and conditioned over many years, will typically graze a paddock relatively uniformly. It stays within fenced boundaries without much prompting. It eats what is in front of it and moves on slowly. The Yellowstone animals did none of this. Even with adequate seasonal grass readily available, they walked 4 to 6 miles every single day, the same rotational movement pattern their ancestors used before fences cut the plains into pieces. To understand why that number matters, you have to understand what the Great Plains grassland was actually built to run on. The prairie did not evolve under stationary grazing pressure. It evolved under the movement of tens of millions of animals crossing enormous distances in seasonal patterns, eating heavily in one area, then moving on before the grass was stripped, giving the land weeks or months to recover before any herd returned. The soil, the root systems, the microbial networks underground, all of it developed in response to that rhythm. Intensive, temporary pressure followed by extended recovery. Not uniform, continuous grazing across a fixed area. When cattle replaced bison across the plains, that rhythm stopped. The land got continuous pressure with no recovery window, and the consequences accumulated across generations of ranching until what had once been one of the most productive grassland ecosystems on Earth was producing a fraction of what it once had. The Yellowstone bison restored the rhythm without being asked to. That distance matters more than it might seem. When grazing pressure spreads thin enough across a large area, no single patch of ground gets eaten down to nothing. The herd moves before the grass is depleted, giving each section time to recover. And as the animals move, their hooves work seeds and dung into the soil along the entire length of their daily route, creating a living planting mechanism that follows their movement across the range. Researchers tracking the herd's movement patterns across the 27,000-acre range found that the Yellowstone animals were covering ground in a way that distributed their impact remarkably evenly across the available habitat. They were not clustering near water sources and overgrazing the surrounding area, which is a common pattern in managed herds. They were not staying in the most sheltered sections of the range through cold snaps. They moved through exposed ground and open terrain the way wild animals do, reading the land and adjusting, not waiting for conditions to be arranged for them. GPS collar data from the lead animals showed movement arcs that corresponded closely to historic bison migration routes documented in 19th century survey records. The behavioral memory was intact. The land was not just being grazed. It was being worked, section by section, in the same rotational pattern the prairie ecosystem had evolved over thousands of years to run on. Scientists had modeled this effect in theory. Watching it happen in real time, documented by aerial survey and soil analysis, was a different experience entirely. One researcher described reviewing the first season's drone data as the moment the project stopped feeling like an experiment and started feeling like something being corrected. The hoof pressure itself was doing work that no restoration budget could replicate at scale. Each step broke the sealed soil surface slightly, created micro-depressions that caught seed and moisture, and introduced organic material from dung into ground that had been biologically depleted by decades of uniform cattle grazing. Across 27,000 acres, multiplied by 4 to 6 miles of daily movement, the cumulative effect on soil structure was measurable within a single season, and it was accelerating. By the second spring, the original cohort had produced over 40 calves born on the Lakota range, native to soil they would never leave. Those calves were significant beyond the population numbers. A bison born on the range learns the range, it learns the water sources, the shelter areas, the movement corridors. Its behavior is shaped by the specific land it grows up on in a way that transferred or relocated animals never fully replicate. The second generation of Lakota bison would carry knowledge of that particular prairie embedded in their patterns from birth. 900 sent to slaughter. The drone survey data from South Dakota State University had already been published by that point. The carbon sequestration numbers, the native grass recovery rates, the bird species nesting in wallow depressions that had not existed the previous year, all of it was documented, sourced, peer-reviewed, and publicly available. Tribal nations with the land, the ecological knowledge, and 15 years of infrastructure waiting were standing in a queue. The Bison Conservation Transfer Program had proven the model worked. The legislation to expand the transfer program had been blocked, slowed, or stripped down at every congressional session since 2016, primarily by representatives from Montana cattle districts. The brucellosis argument had become the mechanism for a policy that was no longer really about disease management. Cattle in the United States have a federal health regulatory pathway that took decades to build. Bison, for most of that time, did not. By the time the quarantine protocol finally existed, the political infrastructure around the cull had calcified. The numbers do not resolve easily. In the 2022-2023 cull season alone, approximately 900 genetically pure Yellowstone bison were sent to commercial slaughter under the interagency Bison Management Plan. In that same 12-month window, the Bison Conservation Transfer Program transferred 55 animals to tribal nations, a number determined not by available land or tribal demand, but by quarantine capacity and political authorization. No version of that comparison looks like a rational conservation decision when you set it next to what the Lakota data was showing in real time. The peer-reviewed evidence that genetically pure wild Yellowstone bison could restore ecologically degraded prairie in a single growing season was sitting in published journals. The tribal nations with the land to receive them were organized, funded, and ready. The quarantine protocol to make transfer possible existed. What the Lakota range demonstrated is that the prairie is not gone. The ecological memory is in the soil. The restoration knowledge is inside the animals that built this ecosystem over thousands of years. And the land management knowledge is carried by the people who worked alongside those animals for 10,000 years before a single fence was driven into the ground. Put those two things back together even at a fraction of their original scale, and the land moves faster than the models say it should. Today, the Lakota Buffalo Range holds over 1,000 bison. The Lakota Nation is hunting them again for the first time in generations. The prairie is following. In the spring of 2023, 13 wild bison stepped off a trailer, sniffed the wind, and within 48 hours they were wallowing. By the second spring, there were 40 calves. Native grasses were expanding into former cattle pasture. Birds were nesting in depressions that had not existed the year before. The water table was rising. A range pushed to its limits for a century was rebuilding itself in ways that surprised the people hired to model it. The bison knew what to do. The land knew what to do. That is what this story is really about, not just restoration, but memory. If you want more stories where the result outran the prediction, subscribe. There is already one waiting for you.